Greetings from First United Methodist Church of Los Alamos, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. We have now resumed in-person worship with one service at 10 a.m., which is live streamed both on Facebook and on YouTube. We alternate each week between contemporary and traditional music. You may confirm worship times and receive more information by visiting our website, firstinyourheart.org. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word.
Our Genesis reading comes from the 24th chapter. After the story of Abraham's call to sacrifice Isaac, we are told that Sarah dies, and Abraham marries again and has 6 more children. But with Sarah's death, he is now responsible for the continuation of the promise and does not want Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman, and so orders his unnamed servant to go back to his homeland to find a wife for Isaac. And that is what the servant does, encountering Rebekah at a well, which is where the passage picks up. Rebekah said to the servant, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." She added, "We have plenty of straw and fodder and a place to spend the night." The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the way to the house of my master's kin." Then the girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran out to the man to the spring. As soon as he had seen the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms, and when he heard the words of his sister Rebekah, "Thus the man spoke to me," he went to the man, and there he was, standing by the camels at the spring. He said, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside when I have prepared the house and a place for the camels?" So the man came into the house, and Laban unloaded the camels and gave him straw and fodder for the camels and water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. Then food was set before him to eat, but he said, "I will not eat until I have told my errand." He said, "Speak on." So he said, "I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, and he has become wealthy. He has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male and female slaves, camels and donkeys. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and he has given him all that he has. My master made me swear, saying, 'You shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I live, but you shall go to my father's house, to my kindred, and get a wife for my son.' I came today to the spring and said, 'O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, if now you will only make successful the way I am going. I am standing here by the spring of water. Let the young woman who comes out to draw, to whom I shall say, "Please give me a little water from your jar to drink," and who will say to me, "Drink, and I will draw for your camels also." Let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son." Before I had finished speaking in my heart, there was Rebekah, coming out with her water jar on her shoulder, and she went down to the spring and drew. I said to her, "Please, let me drink." She quickly let down her jar from her shoulder and said, "Drink, and I will also water your camels." And so I drank, and she also watered the camels. Then I asked her, "Whose daughter are you?" She said, "The daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him." So I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her arms. Then I bowed my head and worshipped the Lord and blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me by the right way to obtain the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. Now then, if you will deal loyally and truly with my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, so that I may turn either to the right hand or to the left. And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" She said, "I will." So they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse, along with Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, "May you, our sister, become thousands of myriads. May your offspring gain possession of the gates of their foes." Then Rebekah and her maids rose up, mounted the camels, and followed the man. Thus the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Now Isaac had come from Beer-lahai and was settled in the Negev. Isaac went out in the evening to walk in the field, and looking up, he saw camels coming. And Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel and said to the servant, "Who is this man over there walking in the field to meet us?" The servant said, "It is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself, and the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. He took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. When we began this worship series, we started at the beginning, Genesis 1:1, in which we're told that God said, "Let there be lights." And what happens? There's lights. And so it means that God's words are important. God creates simply by speaking things into existence. That's how all the first creation story takes place. God says, "Let there," and these things appear. And of course, we as Christians also understand this because we understand that the beginning of the Gospel of John says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And of course, that Word is Jesus. And so God speaks Jesus into the world. So God's words are incredibly important. The most important statement of faith within Judaism, known as the Shema, begins, "Hear, O Israel." Not "Speak, O Israel," or "Believe, O Israel." Hear what God is saying. And then it continues, "The Lord is our God, and the Lord is one." So speaking to God and listening to God are important. And we see that throughout those stories of Genesis that we've talked about. That God speaks with Adam and Eve, and God speaks with Cain, and God speaks with Noah, and God speaks with Abraham. God speaks with Abraham a lot. And every step of Abraham's story, not only is God present and active, but God is speaking, holding conversations with Abraham, and telling Abraham what he should do and what the promises of God are. And yet, in this last story of Abraham's life that we just heard, God doesn't speak. And after what we've heard over the last 2 weeks of God telling Abraham to cast out Hagar and Ishmael, and then God telling Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, we were glad that God isn't speaking anymore in this story. But that passage we heard is a sort of a simple story. It has a nice, easy beginning, a good middle, has a great ending, because we're told that not only is Isaac comforted after Sarah's death, but that he loves Rebekah. And it's not that this is an insignificant story. This is not just a transition between Abraham's story and Isaac's story. This is a story that talks about the foundation of the people who will become the Israelites. That this is how Abraham is participating in continuing the promise that God has made. That you can't have descendants more numerous than stars unless your son also has a wife to match that. This story sets up what we see for the continuation, not just of Genesis, but really of the entirety of Scripture. And yet, God is not there. God is not speaking. So Abraham decides to send his chief servant back to the land that he came from to find a wife for his son Isaac. Why he's concerned about getting a wife amongst his kins rather than amongst the Canaanites, we're not quite sure. But God doesn't say, Isaac can't marry a Canaanite, go back to your kinsmen. Abraham just decides to do that. At least that's what the story looks like. And so the servant sets off with other servants and many gifts, and along with 10 camels, which play an important role in the story. And as he approaches a well near the city of Nahor, he says a little prayer that God might lead him to the right girl. And if you're familiar with biblical stories, your alarm bell should be going off, because a man encountering a woman at a well normally has some marriage implications in it. So we should hear that automatically as he encounters Rebekah, the first woman at the well. And not only does she offer him to drink from the jar of water that she has, she says, "Let me water your camels." And they said there's 10 of them, and camels can drink up to 52 gallons of water at one time. And so she waters the camels, so it's possible that she's pulling 520 gallons out of this well in order to be hospitable to this stranger. And so in that, we should hear about the radical hospitality that Rebekah is doing. We should remember back to the stories of how Abraham and even Lot welcomed strangers into their homes. That this is telling us right away that Rebekah is truly worthy of carrying out God's plans, of being part of the promise that God is going to be bringing out. Being told something very significant about who Rebekah is in this story. But even though Rebekah does what the servant hopes will happen, the servant still does not assume that everything is going to go exactly as he hopes it will. Laban, who's her brother, who does the negotiation for the marriage here, even though her father is still alive, having been some local custom that the brother was doing this engagement versus the father, Laban could have said no, that Rebekah was not going to go. And it's also possible that they asked Rebekah, does she want to go? A very unusual practice in this story. And Rebekah could have said, no, I don't want to leave. And even though Rebekah's brother Laban says, we can see God's movement in here, God never speaks. God is not a main character in this story the way that God has been all the way through the rest of Genesis. Not once does God openly become involved in the plot of this story. Not once does God tell anybody, go along with this, because this is my will for what is to happen. God is strangely silent in this passage. Now, some of you have heard this story before, but I received my call to the ministry. It was actually 25 years ago this summer, which makes me feel really old. And I was studying at St. John's College in Santa Fe on my first master's degree. When we were doing philosophy and religion, we were talking about the story of the golden calf in Exodus. And we were talking about the role of the priesthood, of clergy, in that story. And as we were talking about this, I heard a voice in my head that said, this is where you belong. And it was very clear to me, even though I was not attending church, hadn't attended church for a long time, that it was a call to the ministry, not a call to be involved in academia as much as I love to study. And while I didn't really ignore it, I didn't take it all that seriously either. But those words kept sort of echoing in my mind. I thought, well, that's got to be for somebody else. How could I possibly go into the ministry? It took me more than 3 years hearing those words echoing to finally call up United Methodist Church and say, what would it take what does it look like to join the ministry? What do I have to do? And then it was another year beyond that I finally had to make a decision in my life of whether I was actually going to follow this call or not. And in that 4 years, guess what? God never spoke to me other than those first 5 words. But I had a job at the time that I loved and a boss that I hated. And all we tended to do was fight with one another. And so I was driving into work on a Monday morning, and I started praying, which was not a practice I was doing at the time. And I said, God, if I'm supposed to be doing something else here, You got to tell me what it is, because I don't know. So I went into work, and my boss and I started arguing, again, just as I expected it to be, and I said to her, I don't know what you wanted me. Do you want me to resign? She said yes. And so I walked out the door. It's the only time in my life I've ever done that, ever left a job in that sort of situation. And not once in that conversation did God say, this is what you need to do. As it turned out, I had a job interview that afternoon for a job that would move me to Albuquerque. And my brother, who was living in North Carolina at the time, decided to move back to New Mexico, so we moved in together, and he got a job working with somebody named Mariana, who had a twin sister named Linda. And so within 10.5 months of that prayer of saying to God, you got to tell me what to do, I was living in a new city, had a new job, and had met the woman who would become my wife. And 3.5 years beyond that, we were in Boston, so I was studying at Boston University so I could enter into ministry. And I can see God's movements through all of that, but other than those first 5 words, guess what? God never said anything to me. Now, those 5 words may be more than you have heard from God, and they might be a lot less. But there were certainly times in my life, and over the last 25 years, in which I would have been happier if God said, you need to do this. And if you do this, this is what's going to happen. These are my promises to you. Does that mean that God wasn't present in my life because God didn't say those words to me as much as I was asking for them? Does God not speaking to us mean that God doesn't care for us? Does God not speaking or not trying to guard our actions mean that we're not doing the right thing? I'm sure you figured out those are sort of leading questions, and the answer is no. That just because we don't hear God speaking does not mean that God is not interested in what we're doing. It does not mean that God is not interested in our lives. It does not mean that God is not there for us. Because we've heard these stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs, and God speaking with them and them speaking back to God, but I'm guessing that almost all of us here are much more like the servants. That we're trying to do the right thing, hoping that we're following God's path, but God is not speaking to us the way that God spoke to Abraham, or the way that God spoke to Hagar. I'm guessing that more of us are like the servants than we are like the patriarchs and matriarchs. And I say that because the most common occurrence I have of people saying is, I'm not hearing God talk to me, and I need God's help in this matter. I hear that much more than anybody has ever come to me and said, God's told me to do something, and I need you to help me figure that out. And sometimes I think that's because we sometimes look for the wrong thing. We expect this big, booming voice calling us by name like God does for Abraham. Or perhaps we want that burning bush like Moses gives. And when it doesn't happen, we get disappointed and we say, well, God's not talking to us. But I think we're much more likely to experience God like Elijah does in the 19th chapter of 1 Kings. Because there we're told that Elijah hears a great wind, but is God in the wind? No. And then there's a great earthquake. Is God in the earthquake? No. And then there's a great fire. Is God in the fire? No. And then after the fire, there's that still small voice, or as the New Revised Translation says, there was the sound of sheer silence. And in the silence was God. God is found in the silence. And that statement should scare us because most of us in this culture are not good at silence. We're surrounded by noise all the time. Have you ever been sleeping and you wake up because something different has happened and you realize how quiet it is? That the power has gone off. And all that noise that normally surrounds us, refrigerator humming, electronics humming, the fan going, whatever it might be, has stopped. And it's the silence that has woken us up. Can God be found in the loudness of silence? That's where Elijah encounters God. And not only can God be found there, but I think that's where most often we find God. That's where Laban encounters God. That's where the servant encounters God. That's where Rebekah encounters God, is in the silence. And we should remember that silence and listen have exactly the same letters. Or as John Grossman said, silence is not the absence of something. Silence is the presence of everything. We most often operate our lives without God speaking directly to us. And that's why I think this story is so important for us. That we should see this as more than just a transitional story between the patriarchs or between the matriarchs even. More than just a story of setting up how Isaac met Rebekah. Instead, it's a story about how God operates in our lives. And understand that we have to approach our lives the same way that the servant does. Which is, a servant prays to God or says, this is what I would like to happen. Help me in this task. And the servant expects God is going to be working in there. The same way that Laban says, in what we don't hear from this passage, Laban says, I can see God's will happening here. They all assume that God is present, even though God is not speaking. They all assume that the work of God is taking place, even without the booming voice from heaven, telling them what to do. And so we have to do the same. And we have to look for the ways that God is active in our lives and the ways that God is active in the lives of others. And that's a skill. And like any skill, we get better at it by doing it more and more, by looking how God is speaking in our lives without actually talking. About how God is moving in our lives, even if we might not see it in the moment. And we've started doing that in a weekly newsletter with God Sightings, in which people say, here's how I saw God moving in my life this week. Or this is how I saw God moving in somebody else's life. Or this is how I saw God over the course of a story to bring something to fruition. Hearing these stories helps us remember that God is active in our lives, even if we might not ever hear God speak. That we invite God to participate in our lives through prayer and through action and through listening. Because the servant doesn't wait around for God to tell him what to do, or for God to answer his prayer. He goes to God in prayer and says, here's what I hope will happen, and he keeps acting, trusting that God will be there, trying to do his best to do what is right. And so it is with us. So whether you've heard God say 5 words, or 2,000 words, or no words, God is active in our life. God is participating in our life even when we can't feel God's presence. God is participating in our lives even if we feel like we're having to do all of the work by ourselves. God is participating in our lives even when we feel that everything we're doing might be wrong or we're being thwarted at every opportunity. But God is there. God is participating and present in our lives even when we don't hear God speak. And I know that it is so, my brothers and sisters. Amen. So I'm going to invite the first light to come forward. And so our opportunity, our goal for this week is to simply begin to look for where God is moving in our lives, or where you see God moving in other lives, or to, again, sort of have a story. I started here and I ended up here. Hindsight is 20/20, right? And so often we only see God working through the arc going backwards. To begin working and practicing, noticing where God is working in our lives. And the more you do that, the easier it'll become, the more present God will be for you. So that's our challenge for this coming week. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to follow our YouTube channel and Twitter, and like us on Facebook if you haven't already. And remember that every action you take today could change someone's life. So make sure it's a good one and be an agent of love. God bless.